The US launch of the Sega Saturn. Few times will you hear anything in gaming that is considered a more disastrous event. It's often cited as one of the main reasons the system didn't do well in the region, and you'll see it in damn near every video about the subject. In this episode, I'm going to take you back to 1995 and share my feelings on what went wrong and what could have been done to change the fortunes of Sega's 32-bit entry. It's March of 1995 and Tom Kalinske himself announces that the Sega Saturn will hit North America in September of that year, on what he dubbed as Saturn Day. It was pretty traditional for a US console to be released around a year or so after its Japanese counterpart, and Saturn seemed on a similar trajectory. So you can imagine my surprise when a routine trip to my local video game store Babbage's revealed that Saturn had been launched on one fateful spring day in mid-May, nearly 4 months early. This had been pretty much unprecedented. Video game systems were always carefully marketed releases with loads of fanfare and hype. There were always loads of video game articles and advertisements in magazines getting you ready for the coming products. The fact that Sega was able to keep this quiet was a hell of a PR victory, and the immediate excitement of the event was truly incredible. That's right, I said incredible. Don't believe the nonsense that this was seen as a terrible thing while it was actually happening. Hindsight and second guessing in the years since paints this event in a very negative light, but I can tell you as someone who lived it, it was the talk of the video game world for quite a while, and generated an incredible amount of interest. Helping this early launch was an awesome list of software that was released alongside the system. You never hear much praise for these, but what came out the same day as the Saturn was one of the best launches Sega had ever had software-wise at that point. Virtua Fighter was packed in with the system, and there were an additional 5 games available on day one, all published by Sega. Daytona USA had been a port of the super popular Model 2 arcade game. And while it had some issues with its visuals, the game played incredibly and was one of my favorites on the system in those early days. It didn't do anything to help the PR nightmare that Sega Saturn was a weaker machine than the PlayStation, but it played well enough to have been a better pack-in game at launch than Virtua Fighter. It also would get Panzer Dragoon, a rail shooter that had you flying around on the back of a great dragon. This one was a technical showpiece for the hardware, with great looking environments and huge boss fights. It also had one of the best soundtracks I'd ever heard in a video game. This was one of the Saturn's better looking launch games, and should have been the game Sega advertised the hell out of. Clockwork Knight was a 2.5D platformer set in a Toy Story type world. You were the hero Pepperacci, and you were on a quest to rescue the Clockwork Princess. This one wasn't a gameplay masterpiece, but it did have a pretty solid presentation and a great sense of depth to its backgrounds. It lacked any real gameplay advances over previous 16-bit efforts beyond its visuals, but nothing here was broken or off-putting. Worldwide Soccer Sega International Victory Goal was the best soccer game on the market when it landed along with the Saturn. A brilliant showpiece of visuals and gameplay. This engine should have powered the entire line of Sega sports games in those early days. Even the normally tame golf genre would see a damn fine entry in Pebble Beach Golf Links. It had great animation and was pretty easy to get into, and even had golf pro Craig Statler giving you advice before each hole. While it played pretty good, the lack of any real visual pizzazz hurt its presentation. Those early days the Saturn was on the US market had been truly exciting. The games were mostly good, and people were showing real interest. The die-hard Sega faithful had flocked to the new releases, soaking up most of the initial stock and giving the impression that the Saturn was well on its way to being another hit for Sega. Of course, time, execution, and further mistakes would take what was a potentially great move and squander it to the point of absurdity. And the genesis of it all started on the same day that the system was released, on May 11th at the very first E3. At its initial PlayStation conference, Sony Computer Entertainment of America's president Steve Race took the podium to utter a single price, $2.99, and walked off to thunderous applause.
$299.
This occurred after Sega had already announced that Saturn was on store shelves early and cost $399. This, of course, was Sega's first hurdle in the PR battle with Sony in North America, and they would respond in just about the worst way a company could have. Instead of adjusting their pricing strategy then and there, Sega stayed the course with the $399 price tag. While it's true it cost Sega about $380 to make a Saturn, getting a higher installed base in those early days was far more important to the longer-term success of the Saturn. It would also have taken time for the news of Sony's lower price to filter down to the general public, and Sega had the chance to stop it immediately. Sega's inaction gave interested customers their first red flag when considering buying a Saturn. The Sony machine was going to be $100 cheaper, and with its strengthening software lineup being announced almost weekly, Sega's $399 price point made the system less and less attractive as the PlayStation launch closed in. In fact, Sega would hold on to this ludicrous price strategy for almost an entire month after the PlayStation hit the North American market, 5 months after the Saturn itself had launched. 5 months of potential goodwill and new customers completely decimated. The next hurdle came in software Sega was known for, or should I say, lack thereof. Sega had proliferated its sports franchises during the Genesis era, giving the system a reputation as being a hell of a good place to go if you liked football, baseball, basketball, hockey, soccer, and boxing games. While Sega did right with its Saturn soccer release, it's mind-boggling that they had none of the other popular sports it was known for. It would take many months before other games began to show up, and a year and a half before a Sega-branded NFL football game hit the Saturn. This alone was shockingly poor software management, but it was exacerbated by the fact that EA, maker of the ultra-popular Madden franchise, sit out 1995 and did not release a next-generation entry for the series. This left many Sega sports fans without access to their two favorite football games, and with the Sony-made NFL Game Day getting tons of attention in the press, it was another missed opportunity for Sega. Software in general would become a big issue for Sega after Saturn's launch. The system was released on May 11th, yet it would see next to nothing in the months leading up to the release of the PlayStation in September. Even once its competition was in stores, nothing was coming from Sega of any real interest. Sega was putting out games like Blackfire and Ghen War against Sony's third-party juggernaut of exclusives like Mortal Kombat 3 and Tekken. Sega's resources were split between the Genesis, the Game Gear, the 32X, the Sega CD, and the Saturn, and it simply was in no position to contend with Sony's lone focus on dominating the new 32-bit market with one machine. Sony had rounded up an impressive lot of third-party support, as well as had their own studios focused only on the PlayStation. With Sega's resources split between so many platforms, Sony had an easy time being more attractive to new customers. Sega also had another big problem. The mascot of the company was nowhere to be found. Sonic had been a PR success story, and one of the strongest pillars for the Sega Genesis platform. It was a foregone conclusion that there would be a shiny new Sonic title with the Saturn at launch, or at least shortly thereafter, right? Not only was Sonic absent at launch, it was nowhere to be found in the months after. In fact, if you look on the box of the launch Saturn systems, there is not a single mention or piece of art showing what had been Sega's strongest character. What really pissed me off is that Sega had been sitting on something it easily could have released during the Saturn launch, Sonic CD. The Sega CD market had been minuscule in the grand scheme of things, so the vast majority of gamers had little experience with Sonic CD in early 1995. All Sega had to do was leave the core game intact, put up some nice 2.5D visuals for the backgrounds, and give it fully 3D bonus stages. Job done. The fact that no one at Sega considered this blew my mind. Once you add in the rest of Sonic's story with Sonic Extreme, you seriously have to ask yourself if Sega was deliberately sabotaged by its own execs wanting to take the company third party. As things were, I personally believe Sega was never in any position to defeat Sony during that generation. Sony's hardware was easier to use and third parties were flocking to it. Sony had done enough things right to ensure its PlayStation was going to be a hell of a success. Where the Sega story fits into that success could have been radically different than what we saw had Sega had better decisions leading up to the release of the Saturn in the United States. It should have responded immediately to Sony's price counter, and it needed more of the games that had made the Sega Genesis a success in North America. It's easy for us to look back and say the Saturn had games like Panzer Dragoon, but in 1995, the vast majority of gamers knew absolutely nothing about it. The Saturn needed games like Sonic, Streets of Rage 4, and their sports titles to pull people in so they could discover games like Panzer Dragoon. Without the familiar IPs that Sega had built the success of the Genesis around, it was easy for customers to go where the hype went, straight to Sony and its potent PlayStation campaign. Whether you choose to blame Sega of America or Sega of Japan, I feel every Sega executive on each side should hold their heads low in shame. The amount of bad decisions that accompanied the Saturn spanned hardware, software, advertising, and public relations. And frankly, everyone in charge at Sega had a hand in that debacle. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.